Let me answer it with a hypothetical answer.
Colonel, you testified when I put a question to you that you did not recall whether the Admiral had told you that the President had requested the Attorney General to act. Do you recall that?
I do.
You are the person who volunteered that fact in response to one of my questions. Do you recall that?
I do.
And my question to you was, would that have made a difference? You're the person who surfaced it.
Don't get angry, Counsel. I'm going to answer your question. If the Admiral had told me that the President had asked the Attorney General to conduct a fact-finding inquiry into all of the aspects of what I had done, and that I should tell the Attorney General everything, then I would have done so. Does that answer your question, sir?
And
the Admiral did not tell me that.
And if the Admiral had told you that, you wouldn't have done the quantity of shredding that you did, is that correct?
We can play hypothetical games all night. If the Admiral had told me not to shred, I wouldn't have shredded.
Did you tell the Admiral that you were going to shred?
Pardon?
Did you tell the Admiral that you were going to shred?
I told the Admiral that I was cleaning up my files. I told him that well before this began. I assured him on the 21st that I'd already done most of it.
Mr. Chairman, may I object, please? There has to be a reasonable limit to questions posed about shredding. I mean, how many hours, how many days, how many times? The Colonel has admitted shredding, I would say, conservatively, 125 times. I please respectfully ask, could we move on?
I honestly think, and I'm not trying to be light about it, we spent more time talking about it than I spent doing it. I honestly mean that. I shredded. I was never told not to shred. I shredded because I thought it was the right thing to do. When I didn't have a shredder, I put it in a burn bag and they were burned. And when the time came that I saw the entire situation change and I was faced with the possibility of being the victim of a criminal prosecution, I then took action to protect myself. I took my notebooks home and I took papers home and I kept them until I turned them over to you and to the White House.
Now let's move on to a different subject. I want to talk about Boland. You, in your statement today that you read, said that you felt like you had been caught in the middle of a constitutional battle between the executive branch and Congress over foreign policy prerogatives. Remember that thought?
I do.
We have up on the board the joint resolution, which is called the Boland Amendment. It's one of them. And I'd like you to observe 3 signatures on it, sir. One of them is Thomas O'Neill, Speaker of the House. The next is Strom Thurmond, who was the President pro tem of the Senate. And the third signature is one that you recognize, isn't it?
Certainly is, and I hope all Americans do.
That's the President of the United States.
That's right.
So this bill here, the Boland Amendment, represented a law passed by Congress and signed by the President of the United States, correct?
That is correct.
And
a part of a bill, that's correct.
And you not only have sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution and all of the laws, but you've risked your life to do that. That's fair to say, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
The medals on your chest, which I think all of us respect and know what they stand for, were gained in defending our way of government, correct?
Yes.
You talked very, very eloquently the other day about a democratic outcome in Nicaragua, correct?
I tried to.
And I think you believe...
Point of order. May I ask a question of your staff? May I, Mr. Chairman?
Please.
Is that exhibit, that is not in the form in which the president signed it, or Strom Thurmond, or Thomas P. Tip O'Neill? That's a composite, I believe, part of a huge, large, monstrous continuing resolution with all sorts of things in it. And of course, the name of the game is give it to him in October after the fiscal year is over, and he has to sign it. So I just kind of think there's a little overreaching here by Mr. Liman, as though the president rushed into his Oval Office to sign the Boland Amendment. That was part of a huge appropriation that is absolutely indispensable to keep government going, that the president has to sign literally with a gun to his head, because that's the way we appropriate. We don't consider these things individually on their merits. We wait until the 11th hour of the 11th minute of the 11th day, and then we give them a huge banquet full of appropriations and say, sign it or else. So it just seems to me, Mr. Chairman, there's a little overreaching here by counsel, and I would just like to register. Incidentally, I'm told that was the largest continuing resolution we'd ever passed to date. 13 appropriation bills were in there. So just a little thought that we put it in context.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you for your clarification.
Chairman?
Yes.
I'm sorry to have to do this, and I'm not going to make a speech, but I certainly don't want to be part of an effort to demean the President of the United States, and he doesn't know what he's signing. And the witness is smart enough to have already said as part of the testimony that this represents part of a bill. So he's very much aware of what this is all about.
And I believe the record should show that the President did sign the bill. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, this blow-up was prepared by the House Committee, and as I understand it, reviewed for fairness by all counsel there and accepted by us. It's been used before without objection so far as I know.
Mr. Chairman, it's not accepted by this member. That's a composite. That is not the way the amendment was signed, and it's a little fractional part of a huge bunch of appropriations, and you're pretending that the president read that and he signed it and he knew what I'm sure he knew it was in there, but I'm sure he had to take it. Well, if you're satisfied with that way of appropriating in this Jenkins Hill operation, you can be satisfied with it, but you're not kidding anybody. And I'm not referring to the chairman, I'm referring to whoever dreamed up this composite exhibit, and I thank the chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Colonel North.
Could I ask one additional question? I did not hear an answer to counsel if this is a composite. It looks like a composite to me, and I just want to ask if counsel, is that a composite?
I believe so.
Thank you.
It is.
You know it's a composite?
I know well it is a composite. The president's signature was considerable number of pages later.
Mr. Chairman, in order to have fairness, I'd like to request that an enlargement of the Constitution of the way a law becomes a law be put up there.
I will instruct the staff.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps we could have the whole continuing resolution, of which this was a fractional part, cover the walls.
Colonel, was the Boland Amendment the subject of some discussion at the White House?
It was.
It was not something that slipped through, is that fair to say?
The whole issue of the many different Boland proscriptions and amendments and the like were, for a protracted period of time, the subject of discussion.
You participated with other members of the NSC in an effort to persuade Congress that it was wrong.
Yes, we did.
It was a matter of high priority for the president to continue support to the Contras as a way of bringing pressure on the Sandinista government for what you call a democratic outcome. Is that correct?
It was frequently the subject of presidential public pronouncements, his speeches, and the president was indeed concerned that we be able to continue to provide support to the Nicaraguan resistance.
And you have no doubt that when the President of the United States signed the appropriations bill, he knew he was signing the Boland Amendment into law, correct?
There is no doubt that at the 11th hour of that budget action, an appropriations action, that the President was well aware that it was in it. It was also, as I recall, on the second go-around that we'd had in continuing resolutions that year, as we often do, an effort to pass a budget, that this appeared on the President's desk, and that we were running out of time and money, not just for the Nicaraguan resistance, but for the government of the United States as well.
And you are well aware, sir, that while you served at the NSC, that the President signed some laws which he chose to challenge in courts on grounds of constitutionality, such as the Graham-Rudman bill.
That's true, but I hope you're not going to engage me in a lawyerly debate.
You can assure I will not, because I can see Mr. Sullivan's ready.
Sometimes I can read his mind.
But you understood, sir, that the President signed this and that this was now the law of the land.
Indeed.
And now, prior to the time that the Contras ran out of money in the spring of 1984, is it correct that the CIA was providing them with assistance?
How far have we gone in admitting to that in this
that can be answered yes or no.
Objection. The problem is it's been answered yes 15, 20 times.
Then we would have been past this.
Yes, we would have.
I am still uncertain, Mr. Chairman, as to what it is that we're supposed to be confirming or denying regarding U.S. intelligence activities. And if you tell me I can answer yes to that question, I will do so.
You may answer yes or no.
Yes.
And you then testified that you were given a task of keeping the body and soul of the Contras together, correct?
That is correct.
Whose words are the body and soul?
As they were relayed to me, they were the words of the President.
And did you understand those words to mean to keep them together in the field as a fighting force until Congress turned money back on?
And more. To keep them together as a viable political opposition, to keep them alive in the field, to bridge the time between the time when we would have no money and the time when the Congress would vote again, to keep the effort alive because the President committed publicly to go back, in his words, again and again and again to support the Nicaraguan resistance. And I not only did that, but I went down and talked, as you now know from my notebooks, with the heads of state of Central American and other countries, with the political leadership of those other countries, in an effort to do just exactly that.
Now, did the job...
And I also believe, sir, that that action, direction to me as a member of the President's staff was just as legal as that proscription taking away funding.
And did you understand that that direction was emanating from the President of the United States himself?
I did.
And did I read your expression correctly when you winced yesterday when someone read from the Tower report that the President said that he didn't know that the NSC staff was helping the Contras?
I don't know what you read in my wince. It may have been that my back hurt.
Well, if I were to read this to you, the President told the board on January 26, 1987, that he did not know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras. The board is aware of no evidence to suggest that the President was aware of Lieutenant Colonel North's activities. First, does it come as a surprise to you that the President did not know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras?
And my answer?
Your answer, sir?
It's there in the record.
He's reading from the...
I'm reading from the Tower report.
Could we see a copy, sir, to make sure it's accurate, please?
I think I can read this correctly.
While we have studied the document, I'd like to advise the members of the Senate that a vote is in progress at this time.
The argument has been on the part of the White House that the Bowen Amendment, which constrained or prescribed governmental agencies from providing funds or material assistance of any kind to the Contras, that the White House and the NSC staff, this has been the argument from the White House, the President's staff was not covered by the Bowen Amendment because it was not a governmental agency, it was part of the President's staff.
Your question, sir?
Your counsel has asked to read what the Tower Board report says, and it's in the last paragraph on the page. The President told the board on January 26, 1987, that he did not know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras. Take that sentence.
I read it.
Does that come as a surprise to you?
Yes.
Now, who was it who conveyed the instructions of the President that you should keep the body and the soul of the Contras together?
Mr. Robert C. McFarland.
And over the course of the period that you were at the NSC, you reported, as you've testified regularly, to Mr. McFarland and Mr. Poindexter, Admiral Poindexter, on what you were doing to carry out this mission. Correct?
You have far more than my testimony to confirm that.
And you also reported to Mr. Casey.
That's correct.
Now,
and you have more than my testimony to confirm that.
Is it fair to say Colonel, that you were confronted with a dilemma?
When?
Well, I'll explain what it is, and you'll either confirm it or not. On the one hand, you were told to keep the Contras alive, including as a fighting force, to run what you called a full-service covert operation.
I didn't call it that.
Well, to provide them with covert support, including covert support assisting them militarily. And on the other hand, you had the Boland Amendment there. That present a problem for you, sir?
The question is, did the Boland Amendment create a problem?
Now, did you find
dilemma?
that you were in a conflicted position, sir?
No. We sought means by which we could comply with Boland and still keep the Nicaraguan resistance in the field, politically viable, and supported diplomatically and politically throughout the world.
Now,
and I think we found it.
Now, did you think that you had found those means, sir, when you recommended to your superiors that they sink a ship called the Menimbo?
I didn't ask my superiors to sink a ship. I asked my superiors for their views and recommendations on dealing with that ship.
Did you ask your superiors to assist in providing intelligence and other assistance so that that ship could be sunk?
Maybe we're misunderstanding each other. If I recall the event, I proposed several alternatives for dealing with that ship. I suggested that I do certain things, that the resistance and others associated with resistance do certain things, and if I recall correctly, the ship ended up on its side on the beach.
Did you believe that you were complying with Boland when you made the recommendation to your superiors, which included assisting in the sinking or seizure of the Menimbo?
Indeed, I did.
Did you believe that you were complying with Boland when you took intelligence from the CIA and passed it to the Contras through Robert Owen?
Yes, and the intelligence that I passed myself personally, and it wasn't all from the CIA. Much of it came from the Department of Defense.
And did you understand at the time that the CIA and the Department of Defense couldn't pass that intelligence directly?
Exactly.
And you believe that it was compliance with Boland, that it was fulfilling the purposes of Boland for you to take the intelligence from the CIA or the Department of Defense and pass it to the Contras. That's what you're saying?
I'm not saying that it was fulfilling the purposes of Boland. I'm saying it was working around the problem that Boland would have created and trying to comply with Boland that allowed me to do that.
Well, another word for working around, for people who've had some Latin, is circumvent. Are you saying that you thought you found a legal way of circumventing Boland, or that you found a way of complying with Boland?
I think we found a legal way of complying with Boland.
Did you believe that you found a way of complying with Boland when you were recommending to your superiors that they solicit money from the current donors?
I don't believe I recommended that my superiors solicit money.
If we will look at those memos, but you have no recollection now of having recommended to Mr. McFarland that he go back to the current donors, namely Country 2, to get more money in 1985?
I may well have, counsel, and if you would show me the document, I'm sure it would help to refresh my recollection.
I certainly will. 149.
Exhibit number?
149. There's another one too. If you
I remember the memo.
Colonel North, if you look at your recommendation, it says that the current donors be approached to provide 15 to 20 million additional between now and June 1, 1985.
It does indeed read that way, and I did indeed write the memo.
And did you believe that you were complying with Boland when you made that recommendation?
Absolutely, counsel. I see nothing in section 8066 of the joint resolution that in any way deters, prevents, stops, or prohibits me, Mr. McFarland, or anyone else in the executive branch from going to a current donor or a future donor and doing just exactly what's suggested there. And
Colonel,
if it had prohibited it, I wouldn't have recommended it.
And Colonel, if you look at Exhibit 261, which is another of your memos, this one dated May 1, 1985, you'll see that there it says, recommendation that the current donors be approached to provide the remainder of their $25 million pledge. And then Mr. McFarland crossed out and an additional $15 to $20 million between now and June 1, 1985. You wrote that too, correct?
Certainly.
Now you said that...
But again, counsel, what I'm saying is there is nothing in what you have so graciously put up on the wall that prohibits that action.
Now, isn't it a fact, Colonel, that you and your colleagues in the NSC spent a good deal of time formulating a legislative policy that would get permission from the Congress to solicit third countries for support for the Contras? Is that correct?
Yes.
And do you recall that you wrote memos on that subject, reviewing the options for getting congressional legislation?
That's correct.
And do you recall that after these memos recommending going back to the current donors were written, Congress in December 1985 amended Boland to permit solicitation of humanitarian aid? Do you remember that, sir?
If you say it was in December 85, I'm sure that it must be.
Well, you remember that the bill was passed, correct?
I do.
And it was, I believe, in December of 85, well after this. You remember that, don't you?
Yes.
And so is what you are telling us now that this legislation that you fought to get was superfluous?
No.
Was this legislation that was intended to restrict what you already had the power to do?
Not at all.
You sought this legislation to get authorization for something that somebody in the administration thought you didn't have the power to do, correct?
Not necessarily. As I recall, the entire process of trying to restore what became $100 million worth of aid to the Nicaraguan resistance, is we took it step by step by step. As I recall, the instructions were to bite off a little at a time and start moving back toward full support. And the next step in that was to get appropriated $27 million worth of humanitarian assistance and the permission to get full intelligence support. And finally, we got back to full $100 million worth of military and political support.
Colonel,
going step by step by step.
Colonel, this was an additional bite, getting the permission from Congress to solicit for humanitarian aid, correct? Using your term, bite at a time.
Yes, and to have people besides the National Security Council be able to do those things. But quite honestly, Counsel, I see nothing in either that section of the continuing resolution appropriations, nor the Constitution of the United States, that in any way prohibits the President or his personal staff from interacting with foreign heads of state, as I did, as Mr. McFarland did, or their representatives, to this end.
Colonel, I want you to know I am not trying to take away a legal position that you may have to urge in court if the
I'm not arguing my own
counsel brings a proceeding.
Let me just say something about that, counsel. If I was that concerned about that outcome, I wouldn't be here right now. The fact is, I sincerely believe that the President of the United States can send his emissaries anywhere in the world to talk to anybody about anything. And I think the Constitution hasn't been changed since it was written in that he could do that.
Did you recommend that the President of the United States seek legislation giving permission for the State Department to seek humanitarian aid?
Yes. I was one of many who participated in that.
And at the time you participated in that recommendation, are you telling us you believed that the...
Please continue.
At the time that you participated in that recommendation, are you telling us that you believed that the President of the United States was free to solicit both lethal and humanitarian aid by sending any emissary of his choosing?
From his own staff, any emissary that worked inside the 18 acres known as the White House complex, absolutely no problem whatsoever. And I see nothing inconsistent with asking for legislation to support that and still allowing us to do what we did under Boland.
Did you or any member of your staff ever tell Congress that you already were free to and were engaging in the solicitation of lethal aid at the time you asked Congress for permission to do restricted solicitation of humanitarian aid?
No, and by the way, my staff was, at that point in time, consisted of me and a secretary, so...
Well, did any of your colleagues, to your knowledge, tell that to Congress?
No, very few of my colleagues knew.
In fact, the law changed to permit this limited solicitation in December 1985, and you have already reviewed with Mr. Niels the letters that were written in August of 1985 by Mr. McFarlane saying that you weren't engaged in solicitation and that the NSC staff was abiding by the letter and spirit of Boland.
That's correct.
Now, is what you are telling us today that when you helped in the participation of the letter saying that we are complying with the letter and spirit of Boland, what we are saying is that Boland doesn't apply to us, and so we're complying with its letter and spirit.
Exactly.
And that is what you think is a fair reading of that letter?
Well, I have not denied, counsel. I have admitted that the letters are misleading, evasive, and wrong.
Did you?
I'm talking, if you're talking about the specific part that we're living within the letter of Boland, absolutely.
Now,
and as you know, my recommendation all along was to withhold that information.
But your recommendation all along would have been to confront Congress on this.
You
right?
got it. And if I may, just let me answer that. I think, and I mean no criticism of my superiors or anyone else, but I think, as one of the members of this panel has indicated, that we all would have been better served by that confrontation. Not a confrontation of a lieutenant colonel sitting across from the panel of elected officials of the government of the United States, or even taking it to the Supreme Court in my own defense. But the fact is, there should have been that. And I agree with what one of the members of this panel has said, that that should have been done. But nonetheless, it was chosen to go another way, and I believe that the way we went was legal.
But your commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, chose not to confront Congress on this, correct? correct?
Correct.
And he chose to settle in December 1985 for a law that permitted restricted solicitation for humanitarian purposes.
As one of the steps to getting back to where we are today.
And at the time that he was settling for that compromise, the NSC was conducting its operation as if Boland didn't apply to it and as if it could do whatever solicitation it wanted to do. Correct?
Certainly.
And indeed, if you did not feel that that was the policy of the President of the United States, you never would have participated in the diversion of the Ayatollah's money, which was getting money from Iran, right?
That's correct.
And you've made it very clear, and I think it's painful for you, that whatever you did here, you did because you believed that you were carrying out the policy of the administration. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
Now, you are aware, and it's been referred to by my friend Mr. Niels, that Mr. McFarland said that he considered that the NSC was bound by Boland, correct?
I don't want to admit.
But you're aware he testified to it. You either saw a summary or you watched him on television.
But again,
let's see the testimony if you want to direct our attention to something, Mr. Liman.
Fortunately, I'm prepared.
I knew you would be.
Can I read you something? Will you trust me to read this?
If I did, I wouldn't admit it, but surely, go ahead.
It's for Mr. Couture. Mr. McFarlane, you testified yesterday and the day before about the fact that it was your opinion that the Bowen amendments, particularly the more restrictive of those amendments, applied to the National Security Council. Is that correct? Mr. McFarlane, yes. Question, is that a personal opinion of yours? Answer, yes, sir, and there's more testimony to that effect. You are aware that that's the position he has expressed at these hearings, correct? And if you weren't before, you are now.
Correct.
And as I understand your testimony, other than in the letters that were sent to Congress in which he said that the NSC was abiding by Bowen, you never heard him say that.
I carried out my instructions to the letter to the very best of my ability, Mr. Liman. I have said that innumerable times over the course of the last 3 days.
But can you answer that question, that did you ever hear him say Bowen does not apply to the NSC?
I don't recall him saying that.
You did hear Mr. Casey say that Bowen doesn't apply to the NSC.
At length.
Now, is it correct, sir, that you were put in a position in which everybody was eager and content to have Ollie North do whatever was necessary to energize the Contras, to keep them together as a fighting force, to instill democratic values in them, to open up a Southern front, to promote unity, to provide them with intelligence, to provide them with advice on munitions, to help provide them with that air base in a Central American country. They were all content and eager for you to do this as long as you didn't create a record pinning it on them.
You'd have to ask them.
Well, do you remember, Oliver North, that you had a conversation once with the chief of the Central American Task Force at the CIA right after Boland was passed, and I'm going to show it to you if you don't remember, and that you got criticized for being indiscreet in mentioning what you were doing, and you were told, be more discreet next time. Not that you shouldn't do it.
I recall the event. I don't recall the time.
It's an exhibit here. We don't have to go over it.
I recall it.
But that really was the spirit, wasn't of it all. Don't infect other people with knowledge.
Unnecessary knowledge is the term.
You do it. You provide the deniable link. You take the rap if it gets exposed. That was what this was all about, right?
I have testified to that.
And it's also fair to say that the people who chose you for this knew and appreciated your qualities.
You're asking me to put myself in the minds of other people, counsel. I don't believe that any of those people foresaw the outcome of what has happened.
Well,
I certainly didn't. I do honestly believe that they expected that Ollie would go quietly, and Ollie intended to do so right up until the day that somebody decided to start a criminal prosecution.
Colonel, you characterized yourself, you described yourself as an action-oriented person, correct?
That's correct.
You were the person who, I think in your own statement, people would say, Ollie, fix it, right?
That's correct.
And it would get fixed, right?
Usually.
And you could cut through red tape, right?
Didn't say that in the statement.
Well,
but we did.
We understand each other. I've read enough of what you've written.
Mr. Liman, let me just say one thing. I think it's important for everybody to understand. I don't believe that people for whom I still have an enormous amount of respect, like Mr. McFarland or Admiral Poindexter, would have ever placed me in jeopardy of a criminal prosecution. I don't believe that those men, whether or not the president knew, and I don't think the president would have done that. I don't think anybody intended that Ollie North have to endure having his name be the only one appear on the appointment order for an independent counsel. I think we all saw, I certainly did, that what we were doing was within the limits of the law, that there were great liabilities and that they were principally political, that the liabilities included the protection of the lives of other people, some of whom were at great risk and some of whom have died.
But Oliver North, I hear you saying that if you weren't on the order for the appointment of an independent counsel, if there was agreement that there was no criminal liability here, people would expect you to come before Congress and say, I did it. It's not their fault. I was that loose cannon.
I did do it. I am not, as I said in my statement, at all ashamed of any of the things that I did. I was given a mission, and I tried to carry it out.
But part of that mission was to shield the others who were giving you the orders.
That is the part of any subordinate. Every centurion had a group of shields out in front of him, 100 of them.
Well, would you agree with this proposition Colonel, that, and I think you would, because I think those medals represent it.
No, those medals represent the heroism of the young Marines that I led. That's what they represent.
Do you still have those? You still have those values, don't you?
I never called myself a hero. Those words were used by other people to describe me. I am grateful for those words, but I've never called myself such.
Colonel, 5.5 years in the White House hasn't destroyed those values.
Not at all.
Nor has this investigation destroyed those values.
Not in the least.
And I want to talk about those values, because I think this is important for the American people, that you would agree with the proposition, wouldn't you, that in our desire to promote democracy abroad, including in Nicaragua and elsewhere, we must never sacrifice our democratic values here.
I couldn't agree more.
And that part of those democratic values are that sometimes Congress is going to disagree with the executive branch.
True enough.
And sometimes you, as a military officer, are going to disagree with what the President or the Congress decide as a matter of policy, correct?
Certainly.
And you believe very firmly in civilian control?
Absolutely.
And you do not share the view that was expressed and retracted by your secretary, that sometimes you must rise above the written law?
I do not believe in rising above the law at all. And I do not believe that I have ever stated that.
And you haven't.
I have not.
And when you, Colonel North, had to, in order to protect this operation and your superiors, engage in deception of Congress and deception of other members of the executive branch, it was particularly painful for you in view of the honor code that you subscribed to at Annapolis. Isn't that so?
That is correct.
Now, this covert operation that you found yourself in, helping to direct in Nicaragua for the Contras, was a different type from the covert operations that you had observed in your term at the CIA, at the NSC, right?
It was different in perhaps where it was being directed from. We tried to adhere to the normal procedures that one would in the conduct of a covert operation.
Well,
and indeed, Counsel, that is an important reason for why protection was important.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's what I want to come to.
Well, what I don't want to do is leave you with the idea that the only thing I was doing was trying to protect my superiors. That is indeed an important part in terms of plausible deniability. But part of the destruction and the deception and all the rest of what you have described was to protect those engaged in the operation.
Colonel North, when the CIA was running this operation, it was running it pursuant to a finding. Isn't that so?
That's correct.
And so that there is no misimpression, under our law, covert operations are permitted, correct?
That's correct.
And under our law, which all of us are sworn to uphold, the covert operations are regulated, correct?
Yes.
And the law provides that the President of the United States must make a finding, must put his name on the line in permitting a covert operation. And
again, I'm not trying to play legal scholar. it is my understanding that there is a requirement for a finding pursuant to the CIA's conduct of a covert operation in which U.S. funds are to be expended.
Well, did you understand, Colonel North, that if the president wants to follow the law that Congress passed and that he signed on covert operations, he can sign a finding and let the CIA do it, and if he wants to do it without signing a finding, he can let the NSC do it? Is that what you're saying?
Essentially what I'm saying. I'm not...
So Fielder's choice?
No, I am saying that the president is not precluded by that law, nor is the NSC precluded by that law from conducting the activities that we undertook.
Did you ever hear the President of the United States express that view?
No.
This was an important matter, providing support for the Contras in terms of the president's policies, correct?
The president made innumerable speeches about it. I helped write some of those speeches about it. There's no doubt that aid to the democratic resistance in Nicaragua was a very high priority for the president.
Did you ever see any opinion issued by the Chief Legal Officer of the United States, the Attorney General, saying that the NSC wasn't bound by Bolin and could do these things?
Did I ever see a determination by the Chief Legal Officer of the United States?
The Attorney General.
I understand who the Attorney General is, Counsel. To the effect that the NSC was not bound by Bolin. Is that the question? Mm-hmm. No, I did not. But I worked, as I indicated in my statement, directly for two national security advisors. They are at the right hand of the president. It is my understanding that the president is still charged with the responsibility of the conduct of foreign policy in this country, and I believe that what we were doing is conducting a covert operation in support of that foreign policy.
But the difficulty with that, Colonel North, is one of those national security advisors has testified, and he said he believed Bolin applied, and he told that to Congress. And I'm asking you, did you ever see an opinion of the Attorney General? And you've answered no. Did anyone ever ask, to your knowledge, for an opinion from the President's counsel? Mr. Fielding and then Mr. Wallison on this.
I believe, Counsel, that I sent forward a number of memoranda suggesting various legal opinions from those offices.
Did you get any back?
I don't recall them right now, but I must have generated thousands and thousands of memoranda when I was at the White House, and I don't remember specifically whether I did or not.
Are you saying that you were looking for opinions from the Attorney General or from the White House counsel?
No.
Then what are you saying?
No, I'm just saying that I generated many memoranda, some of which called for certain opinions from the White House counsel. I don't recall whether I got one back or not.
You do not, as you sit here today, have any recollection of any legal officer giving you that opinion other than Scaroni?
Mr. Cerrone, who is a member of the bar, gave us an opinion that indicated that it was legitimate for the National Security Council to pursue these activities.
Did you testify yesterday that you felt that the Intelligence Oversight Board had no jurisdiction over the NSC and you didn't have to give him any facts?
I did.
But when you had a favorable opinion from that board, you were prepared to rely on it. When you didn't want to give them any facts, they had no jurisdiction. Is that what it amounts to?
You can call it what you like.
And was the first time that you were aware of an executive order signed by this president requiring presidential findings for all covert actions when it was called to your attention by Mr. Niels?
You're talking about Executive Order 12333?
Yes, sir.
I was familiar with Executive Order 12333 before Mr. Niels inquired about it.
But your belief was that just as the law signed by the President of the United States on findings didn't apply if he chose to have the NSC do it, that Executive Order 12333 didn't apply if he chose to have the NSC do it?
That is correct.
So it comes down to the fact that because of your belief that the President is the sole authority on foreign policy, he could do whatever he wanted in that field.
Would you repeat that question, please?
Well, does it come down to the fact that from your point of view as the action officer, the staff officer, the person who had to run this covert operation, that if the President wanted it, that was enough?
Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North testifying before the Iran-Contra Committee.
And when the former national security officer, national security advisor says, I didn't know anything about this, and we were complying with Bowen, and when the President of the United States says, I knew nothing about the NSC staff assisting the Contras, you look upon that as just another exercise in deniability. Is that the fact?
You'll have to take that up with them, Counsel.
If we can take for the executive session.
Past 3 days have clearly shown the committee the necessity to study some of the documents in closed session. The questions and answers have come very close to exposing classified information. Therefore, I will entertain a motion to go into closed session to study these classified documents.
Chairman.
Mr. Rudman.
Chairman, pursuant to Committee Rule 2.1, I move that the hearing go into closed session because of the necessity to discuss matters which concern classified information, national security, or the confidential conduct of foreign relations.
Is there a second? There is a second. However, before proceeding to a vote, is there a similar motion for the House Committee?
Mr. Chairman, I will entertain a motion from Representative Cheney regarding conducting the hearing in closed session.
Mr. Chairman, in regard to the sensitive nature of the subject material to be discussed, I move the committee now move into executive session.
We have now before us House and Senate motions to close the hearings. Is there discussion from either Senate or House members before proceeding with the vote? Hearing none, the clerk of the Senate committee will call the roll of senators.
Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Stein?
Aye.
Mr. Spillane?
Aye.
They'll all vote to go into closed session now so that they can examine some documents that are sensitive to national security, including some classified documents, no doubt. We have had another emotionally draining and utterly fascinating afternoon of questioning here before the Joint Congressional Committee investigating the Iran-Contra affair. On the stand, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, his wife in the blueprint dress right behind him.
The House motion to close the hearing, and the clerk will call the roll.
Now the House will call the roll for its side of this vote, and as I say, they will be going into closed committee.